You like birds? Huh?
No, I didn't know.
All right. I'm seeing my friend the hawk is back. Nope. All right. So back to this. So sharecropping. And the thing is, once it became a share of the crop, the landlord would decide what people would grow. Sharecroppers had to grow what the landlord wanted. If you're giving the crop, they're going to say, no, we don't want food products, or we don't want food that you can feed your family, we want cotton. Or we want whatever it's going to be, whatever cash crop they could get. So think about the South, the areas of the darker color would have the greatest, the highest percentages of sharecroppers. And then the significant number of tenant farmers kind of mixed in there with them. And this is incredibly restrictive because if you have to grow cotton, I don't know if you know this, but you can't really eat cotton. Well, you can, but it doesn't really do much for you. So you're gonna have this weird situation that on some of the most fertile soil in the United States, this region here, which was called the Black Belt, with a thick, rich, black soil it had there, you have starvation. Because they're not growing food, they're growing cash crops. And then they have to borrow for food or clothing. And therefore, they never get out of debt. If your crop is going to the landlord, how do you make money? And it's a cycle of debt that's going to be horrific. And then every single state, almost every state in the Union, but especially in the former states of the Confederacy, they will make laws saying no movement unless you pay back your debt. So they're stuck to the land. They're bound to it. Now, there's going to be sharecroppers all over the United States. There'll be sharecroppers in Montana, but the vast majority would be in the states of the former Confederacy. And this is going to be all the poor. It's going to be, yes, a significant number of freedmen and descendants of slaves, but it's also going to be whites. You have this weird situation that you're going to have sharecroppers right next to each other. Some will be freedmen, and some will be either the people or descendants of the people who fought to keep slavery, both in the same economic condition. And it shows you so many of the contradictions of the South. And was this kind of like slavery? A lot. But does anybody know what they call medieval peasants who were bound to the land by debt and feudalism? They're very much like indentured servants, but a little bit different name. Yeah, serfs. They're more like serfs. They're technically free, but they're not really free because they can't leave because of debt. So they're free people, but think about the advantage to the landlords now. In slavery, at least they had to go through the pretense of caring for the slaves, having shelter for them, food for them, even though the slaves would do it all. In sharecropping, the landlords can look at their now more and more starving and impoverished sharecroppers on their land and say, you guys are independent, you're free, you signed the contract, I didn't do it. It's your responsibility. What a system. And soon you have the planter class calling them their labor, even though they're technically free. That's all the time. You read this and worried about their labor leaving, that kind of thing. But it's going to be all over. So on my dad's side is his grandpa, Mike, is my great-great-grandfather. They had a farm south of Omaha, Nebraska. They in the 1920, a disastrous year for farmers in the United States. They have never, to this day, recovered from 1920. We'll get to that a little bit later. And lost his farm, and so they became sharecroppers. And since they had no money, my dad was born on that farm. So I am the grandson of sharecroppers, and my dad was born on a sharecropper's farm because he couldn't afford to go to a hospital. So that's a little bit of my history. In 1944, they lost the farm. They finally couldn't pay it off. So they had to move. And so that's sharecropping. And so this is, we'll just jump right to this. And so in the 1890s, the last gasp to try to hold on to Reconstruction would be called the populist wave. And this was an effort for a multiracial, using racial, the term of different color skin, democracy. That what Reconstruction tried to achieve. But you notice I put a line through it because it did not work. And basically, they called this a fusion party. And all across the South, but most famously in North Carolina. So these were what are called populists, which are mostly kind of like old Democrats and Republicans. The populists, like, well, unfortunately, we still have so much divided by color of skin, where poor white people were normally Democrats or the sharecroppers who realized that the Democratic Party was not helping them. And then Republicans were mostly the black men who could still vote. And they fused together. And the planter class attacked them bitterly. And that's where you get Democrats would be once again bring back the claim of black misrule. So that article right here, this is in a North Carolina paper, alerting white man to meet to attack this. Here is a another North Carolina cartoon. Don't be tempted by the devil, and it's really you only use color of skin. At the ballot box, it's a white man, but the devil is this fusionist, the fusionist party. Well, one of the best known cartoons, and people show this kind of, I see it all the time as generic anti-Reconstruction, anti-multiracial democracy, but it was specific to North Carolina. This cartoon right here, done in 1898. And it's to attack the fusionist party. This is a fusion ballot box. This once again horrible racialized characteristic, this is Negro rule, and it's the tentacles are attacking it very clear. They want to make sure it's white people are being sucked into this and taken in. And it was basically, there was a divide, and this was the wealthy planters were being attacked as they saw it by this fusion party, which were poor whites and poor blacks. But they turned it into black versus white and blew the party up. And this should remind you of something. This is very much like the thinking of Bacon's Rebellion. Remember, Bacon's Rebellion, you had all the underclass, indentured servants, slaves, former slaves who now were free, and this whole variety of people were upset for various reasons at the House of Burgesses. They revolted, the revolt was put down, and that's when they passed the slave codes to divide. And that's exactly what happened. Divide people. And originally it was kind of upper class versus lower class, turned into black versus white. Now, this attack would culminate. There'd be a few cities this would happen. It would happen in Charlotte, it happened also in Atlanta, Georgia, it happened in Knoxville, Tennessee. But the big one was Wilmington, North Carolina. And it was basically an insurrection against a fusionist government that was elected there. And it was a mob, a bloody coup by white mobs. These are what a group called, it's hard to see it because, black and white, but they call themselves the red shirts, and some of them have red shirts on. So kind of the descendants of the Klan, even though the Klan was completely gone by then. And they just overturned the fusionist government. Killed over 150 people. This one mentions 9 black men, but it was significantly more. Government was run out of town, both white and black members of the fusionist party. This one's for the New York Herald. Kind of explains what happened. Here is from Charlotte newspaper, and it says the blacks are to blame. The whites had no choice. And they would reestablish white democratic rule. This ended the fusionist party. And this is going to be called the final redemption, the final end of Reconstruction. And so Reconstruction, you can argue, ended with the Compromise of 1877, but most historians of that era put it about 1898. The final redemption of white rule. And this was the first, but it spread all over. So like Atlanta, they didn't have a full fusionist government, but basically what happened is mobs ran out and forced the resignation with the threat of being lynched. the resignation of fusionist members of the city council and the county council. This is a big deal. And out of this is going to come kind of planter class Democrats will take over. And they will run, and then there'll be business, like upper class would take over. And they unified with northern, I put down monopolists, and this is kind of Republicans and Democrats who are more for, very much for big business. And then they unified together to keep wages down. And boy, is the South going to be plagued by inequality, much like an issue that happens today. In fact, it's no coincidence that that wave of the 1790s would be the first wave of Confederate monuments. This is one that's going to be in North Carolina for Jefferson Davis, who originally was a villain. By the 1890s, he would become a hero of this lost cause. So you start seeing in the 1880s, but especially by the 1890s and going into the 20th century, a series of laws that would begin to segregate the South, and those are the Jim Crow laws. Really start seeing it in the 1890s. Jim Crow, it was a minstrel show. Remember, we had talked about minstrel shows before. I saw in the video on Jackson. And these were shows mostly for working class white audiences. And part of it was to make them feel better. They would make fun of slaves. That is for the sheet music for Jim Crow. And that is a caricature of Jim Crow in the 1880s. And so it's basically making fun of black people. And for some reason, I've seen about 5 different reasons why no one's sure. They started calling these laws Jim Crow laws. These ones we have to know. One of the terms, I guarantee you this will be one of your choices on the semester test. And these are laws that segregated the South, divided everything black and white. Now, it's not just, they could say, well, we want a white-only restaurant, a white-only Coke machine, white in the good seats in the theater, in the upper gallery, the peanut gallery, so to speak, would be for blacks. It's more than that. This is to deny a group of people the ability to participate in the economy. If there are Jim Crow laws, you have a whole group of society that can't participate in commerce. They can't do the normal buying and selling of capitalism. In a capitalistic economy, you're saying that 40% of the South can't participate. They can't through the normal processes of buying and selling goods, of making investments, of planning for the future. They cannot participate. So it's more than just depriving somebody of like sitting at a certain seat in a restaurant. As horrible as that is, that's saying you cannot invest in your future like other people can. And it's telling a massive percentage of the population. That's why this is such a big deal. By the way, this is one of these I had to put in here. Showers, white officers, colored officers. That's at Fort Bragg in North Carolina during World War II. With the segregated United States Army, who part of the justification for the United States going to war would be to fight against ultimate racism of Nazi Germany. And that was the U.S. Army. Lots of contradictions here. But not just that, all those debt restrictions. All the debt restrictions for the sharecroppers would be part of Jim Crow laws. And they were specifically designed to keep poor people bound to the land with few economic opportunities. So you have this whole group of people that cannot participate in the economy. And by definition, what that does is it creates a permanent economic underclass of people that can never truly take advantage of the economic system itself. Or for that matter, wherever it's going to happen. So this economic underclass, yes, it'll be partially by custom economics, but by law. And you can't just all of a sudden shut this off and go back, okay, now everyone's fine. You're going to have one group then that will always be behind. And this is very much the positive good theory. This is the positive good theory. The idea is, well, they're incapable of handling for themselves. That's why we had slavery before, but now we have this system where they'll be controlled. They won't be able to make it on their own. So, by the way, what does this do to wages? Drops wages for whom? Everybody. Everybody's wages will drop. almost. All working people wages will drop. Why? Because you're going to have one group of workers competing with another group of workers that already have, by law, lower wages. You're competing, so you have groups of workers competing with, essentially, underclass workers, who therefore are going to drop everybody's wages. Keeps wages down for whites and blacks. And who benefits? Those who hire. This is a big deal. So it's more, even though we think of, oh, just certain restaurants for certain type of people or hotels or whatever. It's this economic issue that is going to be so pervasive. So to enforce this, there has to be a police state. And speaking of that, let's keep it going. The convict lease system will come out of this. We have this in your notes, but vagrancy. Vagrancy, a vagrant is somebody, and it's very loosely defined, appears to have no visible means of caring for themselves. No visible means of support or a job or working or a home. That's pretty loose. Could it just be someone standing on the street corner? You're not working, you're arrested. So the laws would be quite open to do literal roundups of people. And what amendment allowed for this to happen? The 13th. The 13th Amendment says that prisoners, no more involuntary servitude except for prisoners. And so you'd have these cities would literally round up almost always poor or working class men. And the significant numbers would be, as you can see from this chain gang, forced to work on a private railroad. They'd be significant numbers of black men. And here is in the city of Birmingham, see the chains. That's the term, chain gang. And they would be rented to prominent farms or businesses in the South, AKA they'd be slave laborers. And they would be rented. They wouldn't get the money. The city would get the money. It was a nice little system to just kind of make up a bunch of money. Has anyone ever seen a chain gang? They're still around. Oh, yeah. I've seen them. Saw one in Arkansas and seen one in Mississippi. And it's really, they're working on a road in Mississippi. My wife and I drove by, and it took us, there's like, why are there all those men in orange working on the side of the road? Obviously, different types of prison uniforms today. Like, oh my God, chain. But this happens all the time. Prisoners can be worked at slave wages because of the 13th Amendment. What is it, 40% of the firefighters right now working on LA are prisoners. You don't know what they make. They average about $25 a day to risk their lives. So they can afford to pay, or they can pay those kind of wages because of the 13th Amendment, which is nothing.
It's kind of the same with federal prisons. They offer jobs with like they pay really little. It's just supposed to be like you put it on your books.
Yeah, but the reason they can do that is the 13th Amendment. Oh, by the way, what does that do to wages for people who are not in prison? Drops their wages. Prison labor drops wages. That's when people say, oh, they put prisoners to work. Well, that will cut people's wages. You're competing against people who are paid nothing. So, once again, the positive good theory. Remember the idea of the positive good theory. There must be slavery because either they cannot care for themselves or they're savages and criminals, thus we have to arrest them. Gee, I wonder if this idea would go on to this thing. Next, voter suppression. Now, voter suppression, it's very much related to Jim Crow laws. So the whole goal, destroy the Republican vote. But it's also kind of the poor in general. Keep them from voting. The main reason, terror. I put this picture up one more time because it's such a good example of this there. The Klan, all these other groups. the red shirts we just mentioned in Wilmington, to keep people from voting. And this was quite effective. Quite effective. You want to be lynched? But the most important one would be the Mississippi plan of legal voter suppression. They took advantage of all the problems of the 15th Amendment and kept people from voting. Now, we'll get to this example in 1 second, the most important part of the Mississippi plan, that virtually every state of the former Confederacy and other states would follow. But one of the big things they would do is we have to have these controls on voting because of the rampant voter fraud by Republicans. Republicans will cheat and lie and stuff the ballot box. Now, let's be clear about it. Actually, Democrats were the ones doing it. But they said Republicans did. Now, this, of course, has switched parties, and you could have Republicans in the future saying the same thing about Democrats. Has anyone ever heard about voter fraud today? This is claimed all the time. It was claimed all the time in 2020. The more things change, the more things stay the same. It's amazing how many things echo through history. The same cries about voter fraud or corruption and will be used again against the same kind of people. One more thing we have to mention is a poll tax. Poll taxes are old. This goes back well before the Civil War. But it's a tax usually paid in January, but you can't vote in November unless you pay the tax way back in January. So it just makes it more difficult to vote. But also, if you have no money, even a tiny tax. So this is actually a political cartoon from 1940 about the millions who can't afford to vote and get through the poll tax. And it's now by Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss was a political cartoonist before he started writing children's books. Of course, if you know anything about his books, they're pretty political. He kind of hides that in the children's part. So, the most important part of the Mississippi plan, so put a little arrow or something, was a grandfather's clause. And basically what it said is, you have to pass a literacy test. And I don't know why I capitalized couldn't, but if your grandfather couldn't vote. Now, did this get by the 15th Amendment? Yes, because they could say it applies to everybody. Everybody, regardless of color of skin or condition of servitude or previous condition of servitude, aka slave, it doesn't matter, we all have to apply. It just happens to be that it's going to be the descendants of slaves whose grandfather couldn't vote. But it applies to people who weren't descendants of slaves too. Everybody applies equally. What a great little trick to use the 15th Amendment to act like they're applying to everyone. Now, the literacy test is not like reading and writing. It's your knowledge of government. Your knowledge of government and civics. Has anyone ever seen a literacy test? Did you pass?
This ran in 8th grade municipal trade.
You did one? Did anyone else? Who took one? Anyone? I know Mr. Zarnowski in AP Government always makes the class take one sometime during the year. Yeah, you will. And you will fail. You will all fail. And you're very smart. You know your stuff. It's designed to fail. In fact, the joke was the people administering the test couldn't have passed the test. But they don't have to. Their grandfathers could vote. So it's designed to pass. I got a few examples of it. You know, the questions are really, really narrow. And I remember I knew this stuff and I barely passed. And I knew this. I know this stuff. And geez, there's some questions. I don't know. I can't remember. And it was hard. And it just, yeah, kind of blew. It's one of those things. It shouldn't surprise anybody. But you have this voter suppression and things to make it more difficult to vote. By the turn of the century, 90% of African Americans in the South, 90% of men could not vote. In some places, as high as 98%, like Mississippi and Louisiana. And 30% of whites couldn't vote. Just couldn't pay the poll tax. No. So this kept poor people from voting. And also made people very cynical about democracy. People say, oh, democracy is so good. And there's going to be more and more people saying, well, what has it done for me? And that's a pretty scary moment. People start saying, democracy, what's so great about it? My life is still really tough. That's when people start looking for strong men to take over. There's almost always a man. So this is a key issue. Oh, so have you ever heard the term they're grandfathered in? That comes from this. So I'll give you an example. 1979, the drinking age in Montana was 18. That was the drinking age. And they changed the law to make it 19. Everyone got that? So we get this? But if you had turned 18 before they changed the law, you were grandfathered in and were still legal to alcohol. That's, and then what was it, 86 or 87? Yeah, 87. It went from 19 to 21. Same thing. So people who turned 19 were grandfathered in. That's just an easy example about grandfathering laws. Every state in the union, except for Hawaii, changing drinking age to 21. Huh? Hawaii was 19. The reason why is they wanted everyone to be the same, so the federal government said, we will withhold highway funds unless you change your drinking age. And Hawaii said, well, we don't have enough highways, and we want, that will help our tourism. So that's why Hawaii kept it. So, the most important court case, and also an amazing court case, would be Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. Homer Plessy would be running a test case, partially for the Southern Pacific Railroad, about segregated railroad cars. The Southern Pacific didn't want to pay the extra to have white cars and black cars. And when they ran through the South, and they went all the way up into basically New Orleans, up to Seattle, Washington. And so they said segregated railway cars violates the 14th Amendment. This violates the civil rights on equal protection under the law. Because the reason there are segregated railroads or segregated anything was a concept of white supremacy, which had its economic foundations, as we mentioned before. Well, the Supreme Court ruled 7-2, separate but equal is constitutional. It's constitutional. It is legal. Their reading of the 14th Amendment said that basically private individuals and private entities do not have to guarantee equal rights, or for that matter, states. Which is an amazing ruling, because basically what it's saying is that the Supreme Court has decided that we're not going to care why they actually wrote the 14th Amendment, and we'll decide why they wrote it. When they wrote the 14th Amendment specifically to not have segregated facilities. That's why they wrote it. And they said, nah, we don't want it that way. This kind of sets a dangerous precedent for the Supreme Court. This is huge. And so Jim Crow laws are now constitutional. And the 14th Amendment basically hobbled. Plessy versus Ferguson hasn't been totally overturned. Only parts of it have. Have you ever heard of Brown versus Topeka Board of Education? Okay, that court case desegregated public schools, but it was very narrow, just public schools. And it would have to have an additional Brown 2 to do colleges. And it didn't say anything about private schools so down the road, or for that matter, segregated buses or segregated restaurants. And it's only been partially thrown out. And there's kind of rumbling about bringing it back. So Plessy versus Ferguson, a big, important court case. This fits in with Dred Scott as being two of the most infamous court cases in American history. Dred Scott, it's one of the big ones. Okay, moving on. So what we have developing here is called the Solid South. And the Solid South, therefore, would be by 1900, would be democratic rule. Solid South. Democratic rule. 1964, everything would blow up. So there was basically no Republican Party of any consequence in any states of the former Confederacy. A little bit in Virginia, a little bit in Kentucky, but no, these are. And Oklahoma's a weird kind of hybrid because of what happened after the war. But there's no Republican Party. Basically, whoever was the Democratic nominee would win almost every seat. I mean, it's just so rare to have a Republican win, just a few times here and there. And the South became very insular, like an island, very much separated from the rest of the United States. So you have this interesting situation where you're going to have liberal, very liberal, Northern Democrats who are very much for civil rights, like John Kennedy, 1960, running for president. And he's got to go try to win the Democratic primary in Georgia, and he's got to go and be for civil rights in an anti-civil rights, pro-Jim Crow South. In fact, Georgia had just changed their flag to do the Confederate battle flag. Why? To be anti-civil rights. And that's a solid South. Yeah. One last thing.
I'm just saying that.
Yeah. And so, civil rights, last thing I want to get very quickly. How to deal with second-class citizens. What are African Americans going to do? How do you deal with a situation that they've now rigged the system to be against you? How are you going to deal with it? And there's going to be two options, Booker T. Washington and W.B. Okay, it should be, pronounced it incorrectly, it should be Dubois. But this is the United States, so it's Du Bois. So quick finish this tomorrow, then do the West. Sound good? Well done. Filter agent has an update for you.
Is this the one that is raised? That's crazy. So they have to do a government
My free filter agent has an update for you. No idea.
I just wanted to say thank you.
Oh, you are? That would be good. Yeah.
Just to make sure, I know I said the papers, but I probably there's a United States Senator Space Program and the United States Senator Space Program.
Oh, so the U.S. Senator one. Okay.
The big one.
The big one. All right. Sounds
Have
good.
to like mail it to Steve Davis. His office.
Okay, and make sure. Now, right, I'll write stuff about you. Of course, you're a very good student.
Thank you so much.
But make sure that some of those times the transcripts have got to be confidential.
Oh.
So see.
I have it mailed, like the transcript. Well, like I had it like.
No, I'm not the I mean the recommendation has to
Oh,
be
okay.
confidential. Meaning, I would like to seal it in a special envelope.
If you could seal it, that would be great.
Well, just make sure that's what it's supposed to be.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all.
I can call them.
Yes,
But thank you so much.
no problem. I don't know why I pointed at you.
It was actually not even funny. Conservative cousins who had like a 6th grade.
Hey, they got the semester test. I'm gonna print this. What the heck, right?